Hello and welcome to this episode of the Global Innovators in Business series. In this series, we bring leaders and innovators from different fields to share their advice and experiences with undergraduate students to provide inspiration and motivation during the pandemic. We're so happy to have with us Irving Fain. Irving is the founder and CEO of Bowery Farming, a cutting-edge vertical farming company that is revolutionizing the way we grow foods. Irving has demonstrated an unwavering commitment using technology to create a paradigm shift in how we produce agricultural goods and interact with the world, the land around us. Today's discussion not only covered the traditional founder story, but also how to provide healthy, quality, and sustainable food at scale. Welcome, Irving.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Thank you so much for being here. So, as always, we started our conversation with the first question. Is there a nonprofit or a charity you wanted to dedicate this interview to?
There is, and we chose DC Central Kitchen, which is a close partner of ours at Bowery. And not only are they just doing incredible work in DC, they're tied to Chef Jose Andres and tied to World Central Kitchen, who does incredible work all over the world. And one of the things that really has struck with me is people talk a lot about food access. And one of the big problems in food access is actually just places where you can find the food in communities where grocery stores aren't actually located. So people have to drive, take buses, in some communities, long distances just to even find a grocery store. And your corner market doesn't often have fresh produce and a much wider selection of food that you would normally find in a grocery store. And so one of the programs at DC Central Kitchen is the corner store program, where they actually put coolers inside of these community bodegas and corner stores, and they fill those with fresh produce and other items that normally aren't actually available. And so Bowery is a participant in that program, and it helps to get Bowery produce and fresh produce in general into communities that otherwise have to go long distances just to be able to access that food.
That's so interesting. Wow. Okay, so yes, we'll have the link below. So if you are interested, please go and check it out and learn more about it. To start off your career, was there something in your childhood that kind of sparked this idea for doing entrepreneurship or even looking into sustainability?
The truth is that I have just been an entrepreneur and interested in entrepreneurship for as long as I can remember. I was an 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, and I was just finding myself into every little hustle I could imagine. The story I always tell is I would go down to this corner store, a place called Harrison's, and I would buy these little plastic animals for a dime each. And then I'd bring them all home, and I'd take a Tupperware container and I'd cut out this cardboard and I'd merchandise it into little compartments with all the animals, and I'd bring them into school the next day and I'd sell them for a quarter. And they were not encouraging commerce on the playground. So that business did not last all that long. However, it just points it back, like I didn't even know why or what pushed me into it necessarily, but I was just finding my way into building and creating from a young age. And anyone who knew me when I was young would say, of course, this is what you're doing today. I think farming may throw people for a curve, but other than that, this has been my trajectory for as long as I can remember.
And I know your first founding company was actually not Bowery. So what drove you from iHeartRadio in like a stable career to take the leap of faith into doing something that's like entirely new and create a new company?
I think to understand it for me, you actually got to wind further back. So I got a liberal arts education. And when I was in college, the tech ecosystem was nowhere near what it is today. It's just bursting with opportunity at this point, really. It's just, there's so many places and ways in which you can get involved. And it just wasn't nearly as evolved and mature. It didn't look the way it did today. And so one of the questions I was trying to figure out at that time was, how do you learn business as this liberal arts student? Actually, was an English major of all things. And as a young 20, 21-year-old kid, I said, oh, I'll go to Wall Street and I'll work at an investment bank and that will teach me business. And so I went to New York and I worked in investment banking for a couple of years. It was a great experience. I'm not sure if I'd say it taught me business per se, but it certainly taught me a lot of skills actually that I found valuable to this date. But I knew that wasn't going to be the long trajectory for me. And so what I wanted to do was move into something that was more akin to what I ultimately wanted to do, which was be building and creating. And again, the ecosystem and the opportunities, just in terms of different companies and early stage companies and startups, was so much smaller back then. Did a little bit of venture investing, but then I ended up at Clear Channel. And what I was excited about was because it was this transition from being in an investment capacity to being in an operating capacity. And New York at that time had so much less going on than other parts of the country as well. And so our team was a small team that was dedicated to figuring out what was digital going to mean for this very old school radio company. And so we were working on things like just radio streaming online, building radio website technology, things like this. This was back when MySpace was around. I'm dating myself for sure. It was then that the iPhone came out. And this idea of an app store emerged, and we stopped and said, wow, like we have this incredible asset of 800 some odd stations and amazing content, and we could do something in an aggregation perspective. And so I ended up building and running iHeartRadio. But as interesting and cool as that was, day one of that job, I had a friend who I'd met at Clear Channel. Like we had lunch and we started talking and both realized we were interested in building something of our own. And so we spent 3-4 nights at least a week around the kitchen table after work, eating a Subway sandwich and just pushing around and hacking away at different ideas and different businesses. And that originally, then we got to late 2009 and said, hey, like, at some point we just got to jump in and do this. And so I left iHeart and went on to found my first company, which was a company called CrowdTwist in the enterprise software space.
Having a partner in that beginning stage is so important because you can bounce off ideas, you can talk about things, and it provides like a guidance and companion so that you can like continue and persist that idea. But was that the case in your journey, or how has that helped you?
Yeah, listen, anyone will tell you being a founder and running a company is a lonely journey at some point anyway. And so to have somebody in the co-pilot seat alongside with you, helping navigating is always a valuable component. But the other thing is it can also be just a diversity of perspective. It can be someone who's going to challenge an idea. You can find yourself into this spiral of confirmation bias. And candidly, you can do that with a partner too. But exactly what you said, this idea of having somebody and we could go back and forth on different ideas and talk about what do we like about it and what didn't we like about it and challenge one another was really helpful. And it was also just driving accountability at that time and just continuing at it and moving and just like day after day, trying to push it. I think when I talk about that confirmation bias, one of the things you oftentimes see is people who aren't necessarily native to or don't spend a lot of time in the world of building and developing businesses and early stage companies. You go to them with an idea and people almost feel badly telling you that they don't think it's a good idea or telling you what's wrong with the idea, or maybe they just don't take the time to think about it. And so they're like, oh, that sounds great, Chris. You don't want to tell someone, actually, I think it's a really dumb idea and it will never work. And so I always tell people, even now, when people come pitch me ideas, like I am very direct and very straight and tend to spend time more on the challenges and the potential pitfalls than I do on what I think is great about it, because that oftentimes is the most valuable feedback and the most valuable insight you can get as an entrepreneur who's building. And so having a partner next to you is an embedded ability to ideally do that.
That's such good advice.
You got to find the right people, and that's really important. And the truth is, you can't only look for someone who's going to challenge you even within your organization, though. You've got to find people on the outside who will challenge you and who will push you as well, because that sort of challenge and friction is what makes things better. It's what elevates your idea. It's what elevates your thinking. It's what elevates your strategy and your execution. And so finding the path of more resistance at sometimes in the earlier stages in some areas is a good thing because it shapes the idea in a more effective way.
I see. So then moving on, you sold the company to Oracle, which is such a cool thing. And then at this point, how did the transition go into farming or like this entire industry?
Yes. So I had actually left CrowdTwist even before we'd sold. And I was on the board and I was still involved. And like you said, we ultimately sold to Oracle. It was actually a great outcome for everyone. And the product still lives on today, which I'm happy about because I care about building things that endure. I think that there's a lot of value in that for me, at least. But I picked my head up and said, what was I wanting to do? And the things that mattered to me was working on something I had a personal passion for. And the other piece of it is I've always been a believer that technology and innovation can solve hard problems and important problems. And my first company, CrowdTwist, was really interesting. It was intellectually challenging. It was a really fascinating space at an interesting time in the world of marketing technology. But in some respects, like I wanted to solve what I felt was a bigger and broader problem than the one I was solving for marketing tech and for the companies we worked with. And so I started to look widely at all different types of industries. I was looking at trash and recycling. I was looking at plastics and plastic pollution. And I obviously went to look at agriculture and started to spend a lot of time around the agriculture ecosystem. Yeah. And a lot attracted me to agriculture. First and foremost, it's arguably the oldest and the largest industry in the world. Food and agriculture together are the largest contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions every year. Interestingly, just agriculture is the second largest contributor to global greenhouse gases, just slightly behind energy. Huge, huge source of challenges and problems today and certainly moving forward. An enormous amount of innovation in agriculture, but not necessarily at the time, an enormous amount of digitization. So the number of agriculture technology companies when I was looking around and starting my search in 2014 was relatively small. And I also thought that was really fascinating because I was thinking to myself, wow, here's this massive industry, massive set of problems. And yet a relatively small number of people and companies working on these problems from our world, comparatively to something like marketing technology, where I'd come from, where there was just dozens, hundreds of companies really working on these sets of problems. I thought that dynamic was really interesting and attractive as well, and represented some real opportunity.
That's so interesting. You're looking for a place that you can have a lot of impact, but it's relatively fewer people who are actually focused on it. That's been in existence for such a long time, but still hasn't brought in a lot of that technology into it.
Yeah. In agriculture, don't get me wrong, like sometimes people say, oh, there's been no innovation in agriculture. That's patently false. In fact, like there's been incredible innovation in agriculture over the years, decades and hundreds of years. We are a global population that we are today because of innovation in agriculture in many respects. So the innovation has been enormous, but the digitization, a lot of the tool sets and technologies that you see coming to life in other parts of the economy hadn't necessarily been in agriculture as much. It was starting to happen. You could see it, but that was a really interesting moment. You looked at it, agriculture consumes 70% of the world's water every single year. We put 6 billion pounds of pesticides down annually every single year across the world. And we've lost 30% of all of our arable farmland over the course of the last 40 years. And so there's a real impact in the way that we have been farming, and we have to change. And so I became very interested in this question of like, how can technology be a point of leverage and an opportunity to drive that and deliver some of that change? That's
so interesting. And tell us about Bowery Farming. So tell us about the company, give us like a backdrop and context of what you guys do.
It really is tied to what I was just sharing. And I think the additional context is I was looking at what was happening around the world, and you've got an exploding global population, which is going to reach somewhere between 9 and 10 billion people by 2050. And according to the UN, we'll need somewhere between 50 to 70% more food to feed the global population fairly. I would never suggest that one company or even one industry is going to solve that problem. There's lots of ways that we need to solve this problem. And we need to reduce food waste. We need to help developing countries increase yields, but we do need more net new supply as well. And what really drove me to Bowery specifically, because I initially looked across the entire agricultural ecosystem, was this fact that over the next 20, 30 years, 75 to 80% of the population is going to be living in and around cities. And so there's this real move towards urbanization across the world. And there's some countries, you look at a place like China, where that has happened in spades much more quickly. You see it happening in the US, you see it happening all over the world. And so I became really obsessed with this question of how do you provide fresh food to urban environments? And how do you do that in a way that's not only more efficient, but more sustainable?
I see. I've always heard of this term when I was younger, like living in the greenhouse, like everything is shielded. My life is, they try to shield everything that's negative and bad around. So I guess vertical farming takes this to another level.
That's right.
Could you share what is the main advantages of vertical farming?
Yeah, I'll tell you what we do at Bowery, which is, and you're right, greenhouses have actually been around for a long time, 100 plus years. And the Netherlands is a great example of this. The Netherlands is the #2 global exporter of food in the world, behind the US, which is a pretty interesting stat when you think about the size of the Netherlands compared to a lot of other countries. And a lot of that is credit to the technology and the innovation in agriculture and work in greenhouses. They've done amazing things. What I saw was there was an opportunity with new emerging technologies that hadn't really been present when greenhouses were first being developed and created, that allowed for growing in a way that was even more contained, controlled, and productive than a greenhouse. And if you look at, in essence, indoor growing, we're far from the first people to grow indoors, right? Even outside of the greenhouses, we talk about totally controlled environment. NASA was doing this in the early 80s. So the Russian Space Agency was trying to figure this out because they wanted to know how we're going to grow food when we're all in space. And the real problem had been that the lights themselves were just way too expensive and way too inefficient. So you couldn't grow in any kind of an economical way. And that was the case for some time until about 10 or so years ago, the cost of LED lights dropped by over 85% and the efficiency more than doubled. And that meant that this essentially research and development experiment could actually be done in a more commercially viable way. But what I noticed right off the start was, yes, the lighting piece made indoor farming viable, but it didn't necessarily make it scalable. And to me, scalable is large volumes of crops, large variety of different crop types, consistent high quality, and ultimately a price point that'll open up a large market opportunity. And to grow in a scalable way, started to look at innovation in AI and computer vision, innovation in automation and robotics and material sciences and sensor and control systems. And of course, just storing and processing large amounts of data and pairing that with what was happening in LEDs. And that has become the foundation of what we're building at Bowery. And so we build warehouse scale smart growing environments. We stack our crops from floor to the ceiling. We grow under lights that mimic the spectrum of the sun, and we grow in a totally controlled and contained environment. So that means we can grow 365 days of the year, independent of weather, independent of seasonality. It's reliable, consistent supply of the highest quality produce. And additionally, we grow completely pesticide-free. No herbicides, no fungicides, no insecticides, no pesticides at all. And instead of having challenges in quality and yield, which is what happens if you do that outside, our quality, first of all, our produce is the purest expression of produce. It is what came out of your grandmother's garden. It is what produce was meant to taste like. And from a productivity perspective, we grow more than twice as fast as the field. We get more crop cycles every year than the field does. And we get more yield out of every crop cycle. So we end up 100 times plus more productive comparatively to an outdoor square foot of farmland. And all the while, we use a very small fraction of water compared to traditional agriculture. And what makes all that possible is automation and robotics that we design and develop on our own. Sometimes we build out them with partners where we'll keep our IP protected, but we'll leverage the knowledge and experience of others. And also through what we call the Bowery operating system, which is the brains of our whole operation. And that is software, hardware, computer vision, AI, and sensor and control systems, which really monitor and maintain everything we do. And in the simplest form, what this allows us to do is take a complex supply chain that unfolds over many different players, lots of time and lots of distance, and collapse it down and simplify it into a single building that we locate close to the point of consumption, where we can deliver a product a day or so after harvest versus weeks or even months of time in the traditional value chain.
There's so much to unpack there. It's such an amazing new type of system that you're building together all through this one company. And this means like a change in farm growing as an entire process, from like the supply chain, from the growth, the cycle. One part I wanted to talk about was actually the pesticide side. Like normally just from the pesticide alone, what is the impact to like the health and to the people who like have consumed these type of products?
The truth of it is, Chris, there's lots of impacts from pesticide use that are even beyond the consumption, right? Surprisingly, consuming too many of these chemicals isn't good for any of our own health. And there have been plenty of studies that talk about the different chemicals and the different pesticides that are used and the potentials to cause cancer and other issues like that. But you're ingesting chemicals that are meant to kill things. And so obviously there's a danger in that fundamentally. But the problem with this is there's also dangers just in the application of the pesticides. What does it do to the quality of the topsoil and therefore the nutrients that we rely on to actually continue to have productive and fertile farmland? What is the agricultural runoff impact and the downstream impact? Because I'm sure you've seen photos of these huge algae blooms in the Gulf or up the coast of Florida or wherever it may be, which are really oftentimes the result. And it's not just pesticides. It's actually oftentimes can be fertilizers as well, nitrogen and other chemicals that are used to help the plants grow. But the way in which we oftentimes provide these chemicals to our crops is en masse. and we just drop them so that we can make sure the plants themselves that we want to fertilize or provide pesticides also have what they need. Now, the cost of that is lots of other areas of the field get either fertilized or have pesticides on it that never actually needed it. And so you have this huge runoff when it rains, when there's irrigation that can run downstream in the streams and lakes and rivers and ultimately in the ocean. And there's a huge downstream disadvantage and impact from that as well. Now, fortunately, you're starting to see some technologies in precision agriculture, which can actually apply much more precisely any input when it's needed and where it's needed. And so I believe we're going to move in agriculture closer to that, that reality. And we need to move into that reality, which is why I always say, there's not one solution to a problem that's at the scale of agriculture. This is many lead bullets, not one silver bullet type of problem.
And going into the supply chain side, what did this shift into vertical agriculture mean for the supply chain context to a regular produce that we see in a grocery store? How is it different from something that we would see from Bowery?
Yeah, it's a great question. And then the starting point is you hit the nail on the head. We are absolutely reimagining farming. Come to one of our farms and it does not look like old McDonald's farm is what I would tell you. But the reimagination of farming is actually just a part of what we do, which enables us to actually reinvent the entirety of the supply chain. And what we're doing is really building a shorter, simpler, a safer supply chain, a much more sustainable supply chain, and ultimately providing surety of supply around a system that increasingly has much less surety than we've ever lived with before. And that's one of the really important values that we can deliver. And I'll talk about the other attributes, but we're just living in an increasingly uncertain and unreliable world around us right now. It feels, certainly for me, it is multiple times a week where you wake up and hear about a climatic disruption or a geopolitical issue or problems in the supply chains or with input costs. And the disruption we're seeing and feeling is substantial and compounding. And you don't have to look much further than the food system to really see that take shape. And even just in the crops that we sell today, there's massive challenges in the fields in California and even right now in Arizona around whether it be drought conditions or disease that are wiping out large portions of crops. And so you heard earlier this year, there were shortages on sriracha. I'm a big hot sauce fan. Why? Because it was really difficult to grow hot peppers in the South and in Mexico. And it's just these climatic disruptions in agriculture are increasing. And so the ability to provide surety of supply in critical products for consumers, but also the grocery store in and of itself is very important. Now, beyond that, what we can do is provide a higher quality, longer lasting, more nutritious product as well. And so we deliver our product 24, 36 hours after we harvest it. If you just look at greens and herbs, most of those crops are week and a half to 3 weeks old by the time they even hit the grocery store shelves. And so they'll start going bad on the shelf of the grocer. By the time you bring it home to your refrigerator, we hear from people all the time, they talk about bringing products home and it's just, they're going bad already, or they're bad already. You have a day. Whereas you can bring our product home and it could sit in a refrigerator for a week or two and it would still be good. And so you're reducing food waste, you're providing a fresher product. And the FDA did a study a while ago, over 45% of nutrients are lost from the time a crop is harvested to when it actually gets consumed, just because of the time and the distance it goes. And so by cutting that down, you're also producing a more nutritious crop at the same time. So there's lots of advantages. And the last of which is one that I get really excited about is when you grow food outside, you're relatively constrained to solving for a few variables. So when we think about the food and the seeds and the varieties we grow, there's a lot of talk about biodiversity or the lack thereof in what we eat. And the reason for that is when we think about outside, we think about, do I resist drought? Do I resist pests? And does the crop travel long distances and still look good when it shows? Those are really simply the core drivers of how you choose varieties and seeds to grow. None of those factors impact us at Bowery. We don't have drought, we don't have pests, and we don't have to travel long distances. And so we work with seed companies around the world to find interesting varieties and flavors and tastes that you wouldn't normally find. And our kale, for example, biased, I'll agree I am, but tastes much, much better. And we hear this from consumers all the time. They say, wow, this doesn't taste like what I think about kale tasting. Like it isn't chalky, it isn't chewy, it's like sweeter. And so it brings produce to life because we lost the vibrancy and the flavor and the quality of fresh food at the expense of transportation and a complex supply chain. We've built a supply chain so that you can walk in a grocery store and whatever time of year, you can get whatever you want wherever in the world. And there's a benefit to that, but there's also a cost.
When you talk about fresh, what do you mean in a traditional sense? Like, what is fresh considered in a traditional industry standards, and what is fresh considered in your standard?
I think fresh is a well overused word in our industry. So it's actually a good question. It's funny. No one's ever asked me that question. You actually, in our industry and produce in general, I don't even know how you could define fresh because everybody says it, right? It's a meaningless word in some ways. I think that's the problem, Chris, actually, is that it's been so oversaturated and so overused that a consumer almost hears fresh and they probably discount it, right? Because, oh, everyone says something's fresh. And maybe if going even further, what a consumer may think is it just means it hasn't been processed, right? That maybe that's what a consumer definition would be. What we care about is how do you deliver a product to the retail partner as fast as possible so they can have the highest quality product and last as long as possible on their shelf, so they're not shrinking product out, which reduces food waste, and so their customers can buy the product, they can take it home, and it can be delicious, vibrant, and last a long time in their refrigerator as well. So maximizing that shelf life, but also the quality and the nutritional value for us is critical. And the other piece of it is it's got to be fantastic. The technology we've talked about today is amazing. What our team has built is incredible. I'm in awe of just the creativity and the innovation and the passion people bring every day. But we all agree, and we always talk internally that if the product at the end of it all isn't amazing, then it's all just an interesting science experiment. And so we're focusing and making sure that product delights and wows consumers is important as well.
And that's so true. This entire vertical farming industry is exponentially growing as we are speaking. How do you see Bowery being a part of that? And what is the entire industry going to look like going forward?
Yeah, so I think first of all, like as a longtime entrepreneur myself, I'm really happy to see entrepreneurs thinking about and focusing on solving hard and important problems and working on problems that matter to us. So I think it's great to see the enthusiasm, the excitement for indoor farming in general, because it's indicative of the fact that people are spending their time and energy and technology to solve a different set of problems than maybe a decade or so you would have seen people focused on. The early technology world, take aside chips and things like that, phones, that's different, but a lot of innovation was around consumer internet, enterprise software, places like that. And you're starting to see technology now move into the physical world in an entirely new way. The atoms and bytes combining together. And so this is a great manifestation of that, which I think is really positive. The other part of this is in many ways, it's the natural course of evolution for an industry, which is people see an opportunity, people get really excited. And so I think you're seeing lots and lots of people pour in. And there's different ways of thinking about the industry as well. I think there's people who can be, and we see a lot of this, small scale players servicing a very small area, community, and neighborhood, a small town. Maybe they have a container farm. They sell to some restaurants and some small retailers. I think there's certainly an opportunity to do that. Obviously, what we're doing at Bowery is much larger scale. We work with some of the biggest grocers in the world, Walmart and Whole Foods and Amazon and Safeway Albertsons and Ahold. And we're working with them to make sure we can get food to their distribution centers and so they can get food across their networks. And ultimately, I think there'll be some number of much larger players focused on being not just a US player, but ultimately a global player, because this is a really global opportunity. And so will there eventually be 2,000 vertical farms? I don't know, but what is clear is there'll be a smaller number of larger scale players. Is there going to be one? That seems pretty unlikely. I don't think that's what the world's going to want anyway, but I'm not sure there's going to be 100 either.
I understand. So most of our audience base is students and young professionals looking to build impact in their career. And I think that's been always a very big challenge, because earlier in your career, a lot of times like there's very stark, like you have to feed your family or have a roof on top of your head. There's a lot of different things that before like driving and finding a job that searches for your passion. You talked a little bit about this, but could you share like how did you find your way to pursuing the thing that most closely resembles what you're passionate about, and what kind of advice would you give for students still looking for that?
Yeah, one of the vectors that I paid a lot of attention to when I was exploring ideas was how I graft my level of enthusiasm over time. And what I mean by that is, especially in a world that we're in now, where there's lots and lots of early stage capital sort of searching for new ideas, right? And it's not easy, but you can certainly get people to finance and buy into and get excited about an idea relatively early on. And what I've always found is that there's different curves of ideas, right? Some ideas you get really excited about and then you quickly lose interest. Other ideas you get really excited about and then your excitement kind of plateaus. Other ideas you get really excited about and then over time your excitement dwindles. And so what you can see happen sometimes is people get to that sort of peak of excitement and they say, okay, I'm going to do this. Close towards the peak, and they haven't given themselves enough time to see what's going to happen with enough time elapsing. Is the excitement going to get maintained? Is it going to increase? Is it going to decrease? Is it going to drop off? And so for me personally, I really focused on, as I narrowed myself down, I first of all kept a wide aperture. I started at agriculture broadly, and I looked at things like drones on the farm and satellite imagery and farm management software and automation and what was happening with tractors. And for various reasons, those ideas I thought were really compelling. I just wasn't sure I was the best person to execute on those ideas. And through that exploration, I found myself to what we're building at Bowery. But as I said, I looked at trash and recycling. I was thinking about all different areas. I kept myself open, and I started to spend more and more time on the concept of Bowery, while I simultaneously looked at other things, and I narrowed. But even while I was working on Bowery, I really spent a lot of time and energy thinking about, could you do this economically viably? How so? Could you scale it? And I personally had resisted taking on any capital until I felt like I had sufficiently answered those questions. Different people have different strategies there, but I think the bigger point is, and it's a balance, because you can also find people spending way too much time at some point analyzing an idea, and analysis does get asymptotic at some point, right? There is very much a point of diminishing returns in analysis of an idea, and you have to be careful not to cross over to that range. But the more time I spent thinking about working at Bowery, the less time I wanted to spend on other things, and the more excited I got. And it became clear at some point that my excitement was only increasing. And that for me was a huge driver.
Wow. Thank you so much. And that's really good advice. For Kiki, did you have another question from your side?
Yeah, so amazing to learn the stories and insights you shared in this video. And I think Bowery is really a company reinventing landscape of agriculture. And when we talk about reducing our carbon footprint, I think you reduce the carbon emissions in the transportation, but I guess you may create more carbon emissions in the production, as the lights, they use energy. So how do you think Bowery ties into this journey, having the responsibility to be more sustainable, reduce our carbon footprint where we can? And what impact do you hope to achieve through these efforts?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, most importantly, every one of our farms at Bowery is powered by 100% renewable energy. So we use renewable energy for all of our farms. And when you brought up the transportation piece, which is certainly true, but you have to think about what we were talking about earlier. We're actually really an analog for the entire supply chain today. So everything happening at the farm, all the transportation that has to happen to the processing areas, and then the processing and the packaging and the cold storage and the different distribution center storage along the way. And so in many respects, we are replicating all of that in one building, all powered by renewable energy. Lots of those pieces of the existing today legacy process, those can't even be powered by renewable energy. Eventually, I hope there'll be renewable trucking and all buildings will be powered by renewable energy, but we're not necessarily there yet, tractors, et cetera. So there's a real advantage there, because you have to think about the comparative to the total supply chain. The second part of this, though, is that there's a really powerful trend behind us, which is the lights that we use are getting increasingly more efficient. So it's requiring less and less energy to produce the same photonic energy as time goes on. We've seen the efficiency of our lights since we built Bowery over the last 8 years improve measurably, and we're going to continue to see that. I mean, from when we started, there was that thing of efficiency. A lot of people will say there'll be about another doubling of efficiency again, and then you'll reach an event horizon at that point. But that's a lot more opportunity to decrease energy usage. And with that efficiency in lights, because inefficiency in lights expresses itself as heat, And so you then need HVAC to take that heat out. And so as lights get more efficient, there's less heat generated and there's less of a need to run HVAC as well. So you have this knock-on effect and you're overall using less energy. So there'll be less energy used from our system. We're already using all renewable energy. And then we actually, through our own technologies and our software, we do a lot to reduce our own energy footprint outside of the general curve around LEDs and HVAC as well. So all collectively, we're on a journey where our energy consumption will be less and less, not more and more.
Yes, and very insightful answers. So thank you so much.
Of course.
Yes, thank you, Irving. There's another question on our interview series, which was on Amazon Fresh. One of our audience members was looking at the price of the products of Bowery and realized there's still a slight price premium for Bowery products versus other equivalent produces. And he was asking if that will be a persistent trend going into the future, or is that something that he would hope to potentially like price equivalents with other traditional farming techniques?
So even in the category that we're selling into, so we've grown hundreds and hundreds of varieties. We're excited about this space, Chris, because this is $1 trillion a year market for just the crops that are good candidates at Bowery. That's not every crop. That's not all of agriculture. Things like row crops, corn, wheat, soy, I actually think will be better grown outside and we'll find more sustainable ways to do that. But $1 trillion is a big market and it's a lot of crops. Right now, we focus commercially on leafy greens and herbs. We just launched strawberries last year and we're going to be moving into fruiting crops as well. But what's important is actually all of our products today sell at or below the cost of field grown organic. And so we are price competitive and even sometimes below the cost of organic product coming out of the field right now. And interestingly, you're actually seeing the price of organic produce move up, and you're actually seeing the price of all produce right now move up because there's a substantial amount of cost pressure on outdoor growing from climate, from labor, from supply chains, from input costs. And so, there's going to be upward pressure on traditional agriculture at the same time as technology allows us to provide downward pressure opportunity and margin opportunity as we continue to innovate and we continue to grow and scale the business. How we use that, I think, is something we still think about and always think about. But what's really important to us and has always been core to our mission is how do you democratize access to high quality fresh produce for everybody?
That is so true, and especially in the US market, the grocery stores are more and more expensive. And that's the trend of traditional agriculture going higher and higher, and technology helping to make the price lower and lower for this type of new technology. I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Irving. There's a few small questions, just like for a short answer that's can take this and make it like in a short video. I might ask you just, for example, one question that could you just in 1 minute or less, what is Bowery?
Bowery, we build smart warehouse scale indoor farms where we can grow our crops 365 days of the year, independent of weather and seasonality, stacked floor to ceiling under lights that mimic the spectrum of the sun. We grow pesticide-free, agrochemical-free produce. We are 100 times plus more productive than a square foot of farmland, and we use a tiny fraction of water compared to traditional agriculture. And it's all powered by robotics, automation, software, hardware, computer vision, AI, and sensor and control systems.
And the next question, I watched the different interviews of you beforehand, but one thing I thought was so interesting was the difference between an average apple into the grocery store and average carrots into the grocery store. Could you talk about that?
It always surprises me. I ask, what's the average age of an apple in a grocery store? And the answer is 10 to 14 months. And a carrot is around 9 months. And so, of course, there are fresher carrots and fresher apples, but it actually is indicative of what the supply chain does, which is sources product from all over the world at whatever it can be grown, in some ways freezes it, blasts it with ethylene gas when it's ready to be ripened and actually shipped off to a store. And so in an effort to have fresh food year-round everywhere in the world, there is a cost both to the environment and to the food itself that we all bear.
I see. Okay. If there's one piece of advice you have for students searching for their passion career, what would it be?
I think there's never been a better time to be involved in innovation and involved in the kind of the new generation of the economy globally. And we're seeing the maturation and the evolution of technology. So I was talking about before in the startup world, if you would, from bear companies and consumer internet companies to now focusing on big intractable problems and large, long legacy industries. And so how do we bring all of the incredible technology and innovation into these older industries? And how do we think about the physical world merging with the digital world is going to represent so much opportunity to drive sustainability, more new practices, and new ways of thinking around industries and areas of our economy that in many ways haven't necessarily changed all that materially for quite some time. And so I think whoever you are, whatever you're interested in, the world of innovation is only going to get broader and continue to move faster. And so it's an amazing time, whether you want to start something of your own or be a part of starting something. Both of those are great paths. You have to find the path that's best for you. But I'm so optimistic about what is ahead in the future because I see so much incredible innovation happening right now.
And then one more question is, what is a day like for a CEO founder?
I would say probably somewhat hectic and not necessarily consistent day to day. It depends on the stage in the business. It certainly depends on the business itself, but there's always a percentage of time dedicated to people. People are the most important asset in your business. And one of the things that I love about Bowery is just the extraordinary team that we've built from so many different areas and disciplines and walks of life. And that makes it just fun and exciting to be doing what we're doing every day. But I think an element of this is always being prepared for the unexpected, because there is just a continuum beat of unexpected issues or challenges or opportunities that pop up, and being able to triage, prioritize, and then handle those on a day-to-day basis is in many ways the name of the game.
Got it. Irving, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure to talk to you.